All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. If you'd like to put in the chat where you're dialing in from today, Jenifer and I would just love to see who is represented from across the world. And Abhijit, I would love it if you could go ahead and share our presentation so we can kick things off. That would be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So put in the chat, and listeners, where you're dialing in from so we can get a sense. And we'll go ahead and get started. I see New York is in the audience. Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. Lots of other folks tuning in. So welcome everyone. I'm Scott Brownlee. I'm one of the coaches at Fortuna. We're an admissions consulting firm that's composed of a dream team of admissions directors from all of the top business schools. You can see those there on the screen. We provide strategic guidance and feedback to clients that we work with one-on-one, and we do give free consultations. And today what we're doing is talking a little bit about the Stanford and Harvard essays, which I know as you all go into round two, you are thinking a lot about and probably looking for some tips and tricks. So we're going to be happy to provide some guidance to you today on those. Jenifer, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Jenifer Raver, and I am a senior expert coach at Fortuna Admissions, where I've worked now this is my 6th season with Fortuna. Prior to Fortuna, I worked in the MBA admission space and higher ed, mainly in Asia, but definitely with internationals from around the world. I also have an MBA myself from Wharton, where I earned a dual degree, an MBA and an MA from Wharton and Lauder. So that program and internationals as well as third culture people are near and dear to my heart. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Jenifer. I feel similarly, a little bit different background from Jenifer, but just by way of biography. So I have been a career coach for MBA students at UT Austin, where I primarily worked with international students, but domestic students as well. And also worked for Forte Foundation, a nonprofit that supports women applying to business school. So any women in the audience, you might check out Forte. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about why effective storytelling is important, particularly in Stanford Essay 1 and the single Harvard essay. And we're going to talk a little bit about then how you can target your essay approach. And we thought it would be fun. Jenifer and I came up with some personas, some not real applicants, but imagined applicants based on the client work that, as Jenifer mentioned, she's done for many years, and I've done for multiple years as well. And we're going to give you some examples, stories that I think will hopefully be helpful as you look to put together your own essays. But the most important time we want to spend today is really doing some Q&A. You'll see that we have Q&A listed twice because we think that's really important, and certainly would love to answer your questions. So as we're sharing our initial content, please feel free to write in the chat questions you have. If we don't address them in that moment, we will address them at the end of the session. Know that there is time for that. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind you to please hit like for the GMAT Club folks. This would help boost today's session for them. So if you could hit like, if you're on whatever streaming tool you're using, that would be fantastic. So to kick us off first, let's talk about why are storytelling and branding important for Stanford and Harvard. The first essay in the case of Stanford, and then the single Harvard essay. I think this really comes down to memorability. And I think part of that is because there are so many folks that are applying to both of these top business school programs. And you can imagine if you were an application reader on admissions committee, you read 10 to 20 applications a day. What can you do as a candidate to stand out and be memorable? So what I want you to do, audience members, on the screen here, we've got 4 different stories, and I want you to think about which story and react. Please share in the chat, which story do you find most memorable, or which would you most remember, imagining that you were actually an admissions committee member reading applications. So we've got 4 examples here. We've got action-oriented Alyssa, and her kind of anchor for her story is that she raised $3 million in 3 days to create a new app that tracks dogs' blood pressure over time. So dog lover in the case of Alyssa. We've got can't get off track Kyle. Kyle was promoted 2 times in the past 4 years and received his firm's highest performance rating. So he's really kind of on that path of growth and leadership that business schools like to see. We've got McKinsey Manisha. Manisha successfully obtained a role at McKinsey despite no on-campus recruiting at her university. Always a challenge when you're going for the MBB to accomplish that. And then we've got going big Gustavo, who built, flew, crashed, rebuilt, then reflew his own solar-powered airplane across Florida. So maybe in the chat, if you all want to chime in and say which of the four do you find most memorable? And I think this is an interesting way to start our conversation around these essays, because a lot of the times when you think of your essays, you might start with your kind of work accomplishments or things that are maybe kind of more easily referred or thought about. It looks like Dr. Dremate in the chat has said Gustavo, right? So there's that element of something kind of out of left field that is memorable. We've got some Alyssa's in the audience, so raising that money for that startup, right? Especially when you're early in your career, certainly raising money is not easy to do. Anyone for Kyle or Manisha finding that more memorable? We'll just take a second. Interesting to see. It looks like, Jenifer, that the Gustavos and the Alyssa's are winning the memorability contest from this small audience. Well, what we're going to do here in a little bit, not immediately, but we're going to return to these stories. So a way to kind of think about these candidates and these profiles. And we're gonna talk about ways in which they could tell their stories in effective ways to maybe make them more memorable, right? To really kind of stand out and make them more singular and tie them then to what Harvard and Stanford admissions committees might be looking to see. We do have some Manishas in the audience, so thank you for those Manisha votes. Ariana says she can relate to Manisha. Yeah, and I think that's true. I think relatability is an important part of writing a successful essay as well. So before we dive into those examples and some ideas we'd have for mapping those kind of key stories to actual essays, Jenifer's going to talk a little bit about how you can target your essay approach for the two different schools, because they are certainly not the same, and the admissions committees are certainly looking for a little bit different content. So Jenifer, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the key differences between the Stanford and Harvard essay.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott. Okay, so these are two very different schools, culturally speaking, excellent schools, both of them. And many of our clients, I dare say most of our clients, do apply to either Stanford, HBS, or both. So it is really crucial for you, the applicant, to understand what these schools are looking for within their essay or essays in the case of Stanford. But we're only going to take Stanford GSB's Essay 1. High level, I would say that Stanford is really looking to get to know you, the person, the holistic human being that you are. So writing from the heart rather than focusing on your professional accomplishments, which may be excellent, is really crucial. They can see your professional accomplishments as well as your academic accomplishments in various parts of your application. So thinking about how you've become the person you are and all that went into that, and really going back in time and thinking about yourself as a young person, though you're still young, looking at your childhood and your early adulthood until now is really crucial. And that's something that our team will work with you on. And as noted here, Essay 2 and even the optional essays, which are not optional for Stanford, are a time in which you can talk about yourself, the professional. Turning to HBS, HBS asks the question, tell us something about you that we can't see from other aspects of your application. This is crucial. They do want to get to know you, the person, but I would focus on impact and how you have impacted. It could be the workplace. Of course, they can see that from the resume. So think a little bit more broadly about your impact in your communities to date. And you could be going back in time. And I would also be sure to include your impact in the last year or two in your communities, whether professional or personal. Essentially, don't make the mistake of using word count for your HBS essay where you're saying you're rehashing your professional achievements or information that they could find elsewhere in your biodata. Okay, and I'm going to pause there because I have said a lot.
Jenifer, while the audience is percolating, I would say audience members, if you do have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. I'm just curious, you've worked with a lot of candidates, Jenifer, on these two different essays, and that Stanford essay, 900 words, is quite long. I'm wondering, do you
Yes.
ever have clients that face the challenge of trying to kind of fit multiple things into that, and how you help them navigate it? This is an interesting challenge of that longer essay.
Thank you, Scott. Absolutely. And what is also good to know is that, for Stanford, that word count, it's, I believe, and we'll all have to double check this, but between essays 1 and 2, you have 1,050 words. So if you need a little bit more real estate or word count for your first essay, you can take that. Now, ideally, it's about a 60-40, right? 60%, 40% split between the two. And Scott, your question with HBS specifically, please ask me it again. So I'm answering it.
Sure. Yeah, of course. And we do have some audience questions coming in, which is
Yes.
great. But I think, Jenifer, that question, that 900 words, right, that ends up being double spaced, roughly 3 to 4 pages. And so a lot of times I'll have clients who are trying to fit multiple things in and kind of struggling with how to make the pieces fit together. So do you have kind of advice for the audience around how to be, how to use that 900 words effectively, right? To not just kind of fill up the space, but to really use it wisely.
Absolutely. So when I'm working with clients on HBS, I don't like to limit word count to begin with, because I like to see what the client is going to put down. We do want to explore all major themes, sub themes, or minor themes, because initially it's not the time to limit yourself. And usually it takes anywhere, I would say, for HBS from minimum 4 drafts and sometimes up to 7 or 8. So I do think it's important. Open yourself up, see what appears on the page, really free flow, thinking at first, putting it all down, and then relying on your coach or your team to really help you structure. And hey, this is really an interesting theme. Let's develop this more. This theme seems important, but it's not necessarily going to go with a major theme. So relying on your team to really help you whittle down, or as I say, mine for the gold. What is the gold that's coming out? It does take theme. It does take time to develop your themes, and it is messy. And I think that's really important to remember, that this isn't a work report that you can bang out in 2 to 4 hours and you're going to be done. You need time between drafts to really think about, okay, this is what I am actually trying to say. So trusting the process, starting as early as you can, and really giving yourself time between drafts, what we call in academic speak, soak time. Okay, and I'll pause there.
No, that's so great, Jenifer, and I love that you emphasize the importance of the first draft might be 1,100, 1,200 words. I think that's pretty common. Yes. And I work with my clients, and then we work together to kind of compress that down to the most memorable, impactful moments. So you made some good points about the importance of not kind of duplicating information, Jenifer. And so we have an audience question around that. So someone asked in the HBS essay, when you say to not rehash points already mentioned in your application, what about impact that's touched upon in recommendations? Your recommender, for example, might be saying some X or Y about you. Is that something you'd want to reference again in your essay, or do you feel like that's kind of duplicative, Jenifer?
I actually see it as a positive and showing consistency, between and among what you are saying about yourself and what your recommender or recommenders are also saying about you. So as long as it can be handled in an elegant way and not directly quoting your recommender, because of course, ideally you haven't read your recommendations. But of course, if it's echoing something your recommender or recommender has said about your impact, yes, please do that.
Great. Let's see, lots of questions coming in. We won't have time for all of them, but certainly can do one or two more. Let's see. So here's a question about planning, Jenifer. You're like, we always like folks who are planning ahead. This person's maybe applying maybe in fall of 2026, so in a couple years. And they're curious, does it make sense to start practicing my essays now and updating and redrafting, or would it be better, do you think, to wait and maybe start drafting maybe 6 months before the application? Thoughts on that, Jenifer, on pre-writing that far in advance? It's an interesting question.
I have never been asked this question. So well done, Dr. Dre. Matt, you are clearly a planner. I would say journaling around who you are and what's going on in your life actually may be more helpful and valuable rather than actually the essays themselves and doing them on a yearly basis. I absolutely think 6 months in advance to start your essays is excellent and frankly ideal. But I don't think you have to do it every year. But journaling can actually be very valuable for you, the MBA applicant, and just you, the person.
That's great advice. I would echo that. I think that the journaling gets at that, particularly the Stanford emphasis on writing from the heart, right, Jenifer? And I know that always throws off clients. They're always like, writing from the heart. Like, I've never done that before. I was a business major in undergrad. I studied accounting. I didn't have a class where I got to do that. So that journaling aspect can be a great way to start to think about yourself across dimensions. So like, you're a certain version of yourself at work. What version of yourself shows up in your home life? What version of yourself shows up when you're volunteering or giving back to others or mentoring or just doing something you're really passionate about? A lot of times those things are memorable and they're related to your professional persona, maybe in ways that you wouldn't think about. We've got a question. This is always a funny one. Kelvin's wondering, is there a strict restriction on the word count? Kind of what's the limit? Kelvin, in general, the way that this works, I think this is true for all MBA applications, is there's not typically a kind of a text editor that you're plugging this into that has like a hard count on words, but it is expected that you stay within the count that the schools are asking for. So you wouldn't want to submit like a 1,700 word essay, right, to HBS, or a 1,200 word essay to Stanford. You want to stay within those constraints that they have. That said, if you're a word or two over, usually that's going to be okay. So that kind of just general good advice to know in terms of how you approach the word counts and the limits. So there's something to keep in mind. Jenifer, I think let's see. Someone asked, Ariana asked, could you share an example of writing about achievements that aren't covered on your resume? So that's an interesting one, Jenifer. Have you ever had a client where they had an interesting achievement that maybe wasn't professional or maybe didn't fit on the single page that we're often trying to get them to, and that they ended up talking about in the essay? Yeah.
Well, let me give you an example, Ariana. So, for example, I've worked with several clients who have really thrown themselves into DEI initiatives at work. And on paper, it may appear that they're either women, people of color, or part of a minority group that has historically had less representation in workplaces worldwide. But what I find really interesting and insightful is if they talk about why they got involved. See, the why is not explained in a resume or in say, the biodata section for your extracurriculars or volunteer work. So I've had several clients find that they are the only one in the room like themselves. And this has really, and at times it's been very difficult as a woman. If you've gone to an offsite, a factory, and there are no women bathrooms, you, the woman, have to be accompanied by a male every time you want to use the bathroom. This, in one young woman's case, this really galvanized her to get involved in DEI in her workplace to ensure that her colleagues, her female colleagues, as well as future woman colleagues, did not have the same experience. And that is worth talking about in an essay, I believe. So the why.
That's great advice, Jenifer. Yeah, I think, Ariana, I would just add to that. Sometimes, not necessarily achievements per se, but elements of identity that don't get covered on the resume can come out and be explored in an essay. I'll give you an example. I've worked with multiple clients in the past who had a religious identity where they were a minority in the country where they lived, right? And day to day, that didn't always surface, but they might have been, for example, the only Muslim person on their team of 20 people, right? And sometimes that showed up. Happy hour navigating that as someone who didn't drink alcohol, put them in a unique position, and they're actually able to kind of like get closer to the team through that experience. Although it was, at first it was a challenge. So I think that you can think about identity. It's not an achievement per se, right? But it's a part of your kind of your profile that you forget about, right? And a lot of times we show up to these applications with multiple identities that maybe don't maybe even directly connect to our workplace persona, but they're really important to us. And I would encourage you to kind of lean into those. And to Jenifer's point, like it's okay to kind of tell a story that's specific like that. If it kind of sheds light on what the kind of unique challenges that you faced and the things that you've gone through. And again, it comes back to that question of memorability, right? Like humans are natural kind of storytellers and love listening to stories and being drawn into to plot, right? And so like kind of giving some narrative structure can be really helpful. Great. So let's see if any other questions have come in. I think, Jenifer, I think we've answered all their questions, which is great on that portion. So maybe it'd be fun to dive into a little bit of a look at some actual structuring of essays for the folks in the audience that maybe had kind of a STEM background. If you had matrices, if you're a business school student and you had matrices that you worked with, I thought it would be fun to give a little structure to this, give you a little table. A little table that breaks down some different approaches to story. As we think about essays, and we'll talk through. I'm going to take two of these folks, and Jenifer will take two. But just want to highlight for you our conception of essays here, successful essays. We would submit to you, audience members, that there's usually kind of three main components of an essay, not paragraphs, right? We're not talking about a 3 or 5 paragraph essay here, but 3 components to a successful essay. One is this kind of key life transition point. And this is going to be a time in your life. Oftentimes, I think folks, when they think of this and they think of these essays, they think that a trauma or something really negative that's happened to you would be your life transition point. But it's just as equally true that it could just be a time when everything changed for you. Maybe you got a new job that sent you to a new country and you had to learn a new culture and you were out of your comfort zone and you had to hit reset and really learn and grow. So think of that transition point. It could be certainly a negative experience, but could just as equally be a positive one. Think really about impact, right? Times in your life that really changed you. And then in the essay, it's going to be helpful to address a transformation that you went through as a result of that change. So if you did go through a transformation, maybe that's not the right change to address in the essay, but a subsequent transformation, kind of steps you took or experiences you had that kind of moved you from the person you were before the experience to the person you were after. And then it's also going to be important to tie those things, to tie that key life transition point and to tie that subsequent transformation you had to kind of the impacts in terms of career in B school. And that's where you can kind of attach and connect questions around like why a particular business school is relevant for your journey, right? And why it's kind of the inevitable place that you want to end up. So thinking about those 3 kind of buckets or facets: key life transition point, subsequent transformation, and then career B school impact. Let's look at Alyssa. So we're imagining here that Alyssa kind of has some backstory to that statement that she gave us, right? Thinking back to the memorability slide where she said she raised $3 million for her startup. So let's imagine that part of Alyssa's story was that she volunteered for an overwhelmed animal shelter while in high school. Interesting thing about this, it's not directly related to maybe her career, her work experience, her promotions, things like that, but it's a formative experience for her, right? She was in high school, she worked at this shelter, and she really found a knack and a passion for that work. And while she was there, she had that experience. She went through a little bit of a transformation where she discovered that there was a lack of basic diagnostic tools for dog health and became a lifelong advocate. So she would have to, kind of share that in a reasonable word count, but that adds up to her kind of career goal and her approaching GSB in this case, having worked for Chewy. So let's imagine that she followed her passion for working with animals to actually a company that supports pets. She worked there by day, but then she's planning the launch of her company by night that she's raised the $3 million for. and she needs GSB to help her scale her new business, right? So you see what we did there? We started with a key life transition point, a moment that was transformative. We talked about how that transformed us as a person, and then we tied it to that particular school, right? And in the case of GSB, right, it's known for helping founders kind of take that next step with their company, and so there's a nice natural fit there that could be potentially woven into the essay. So that's Alyssa. Jenifer, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about Kyle.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So Kyle's profile is one of those examples where Kyle, has really faced an extreme situation. In his case, he was nearly left homeless while a child, and he and his family, in the 2008 recession. And, as I think about sometimes as we work with clients, sometimes there are financial struggles that they and their family have experienced in the past. And that's why they very much want to go into business to succeed in their chosen profession, no matter which industry or function. And certainly in Kyle's case, he decided financial security definitely was not to be taken for granted, that he wanted to focus on ensuring his financial security and those of his loved ones. So he really looked for structure and predictability at work. And that's why he was promoted twice in 4 years. And yet also Kyle didn't just focus on himself, which was important that he do so, as we would encourage all of you to do. But he also, through mentorship, wanted to help new employees and more junior employees find security and career progression for themselves. So he believes that HBS is the ideal place for him, as he looks to go on, progress in his own career, and probably through consulting. Scott, if I'm reading this slide correctly, he sees himself doing consulting initially to give himself more depth and breadth across industries, before he goes on to his long-term goal. So I think what I'd like to highlight with Kyle is he's absolutely ambitious, and that comes across in his resume and his application, his recommendations. His recommenders may or may not know that he struggled with potential homelessness as a child. He doesn't have to share that with his recommenders, but I absolutely think if he's comfortable with sharing this, and not to re-traumatize him, but sharing aspects of his story and why it's so important for him to do well in his career and also help uplift others. So in a tide, all boats rise. And that's a beautiful expression that I think is really important, is to help carry others along. Okay, I'll stop there, Scott.
That's a wonderful summary of Kyle, Jenifer. And I think what's interesting to point out and build upon what you said is that when we were doing the initial memorability, we're looking at the quotes, no one said Kyle was the most memorable, right? But if Kyle does this work, right, of painting this picture of the kind of the vulnerable place he was in and what he was experiencing as a kid, and how that is why he's the way he is, right? That informs his mentorship. That informs kind of why he is who he is professionally. Then it's a lot more memorable, right? And it does start to kind of like jump through the page. And I think it's interesting, if we had redone the little survey of whose story was the most memorable, Kyle's now might actually jump to the top of the list. Now it depends on how he tells that story. Certainly, as he works with his consultant on kind of like telling that, you want to make sure that you're, not over-indexing on the story, not over-indexing on childhood, right, to the detriment of talking about your career and the mentorship and what's important to you. But sometimes sharing that kernel of your real lived experience that's not professional really informs who you are professionally. And so I think it can be really helpful. So maybe we think of Kyle a little differently now that we know his full story. In Manisha's case, she was the candidate, if you remember back, that that was able to get a job at McKinsey despite no on-campus recruiting at her university. So she is a Nepalese student at Kathmandu University in this example. And she actually, the journey she went on to kind of get that internship at McKinsey, she actually changed her major. She was a literature major. She showed up as a true poet rather than a quant, right? If you read poets and quants, you'll get that reference. She showed up as a poet, a literature major, but then fell in love with finance when she took a class in it. And to make that pivot to kind of say, oh, I actually want to do business instead of, being maybe getting my PhD in literature or something like that. She had to take on a financial burden of additional tuition and an extra year of college to go ahead and make that finance pivot happen. And, take out some money, some loans, maybe that she didn't expect to, maybe get a part-time job that she didn't have when she went into college. And that really made her grow up in a kind of an accelerated way and kind of think about her career and what she wanted out of, her professional life and goals more quickly than she would have otherwise. And that's what's kind of led up to her ultimately wanting to kind of reach out to and build a support network for women like her who maybe when they got to college didn't know that consulting was an opportunity they could take advantage of, right? And so that doing that specifically for Nepali women at home, but then globally is kind of part of her brand and part of her go-to-market as she looks to make a match with the business school. And so when she looks at HBS and she sees certainly other McKinsey folks who are applying there, she's committed to creating recruiting opportunities that she didn't get on campus when she was a student for other women that are like her from her part of the world, but also more broadly. So it's interesting that you can take an experience you had, right, a formative experience like something even as simple as changing your major, and it really sets you on a journey in terms of having to kind of maybe grow up more quickly, kind of have a different experience. And end up with kind of different goals that are shaped a little bit uniquely. So I think that's just an interesting example of something that seems small, right? Changing your major could have a big impact, not only on, how long you're studying at university, but also, where your career ends up. And it's also an opportunity and a kind of a touch point where you could give back to maybe other students who had that same experience, which that's what's great about Manisha, right? She doesn't just stop at herself. She thinks about how can I help other people not have the same experience I did? How can I improve upon my own experience and help other people have maybe a little bit easier journey, a little bit easier path? I'll pause there on Manisha. Jenifer, you want to talk about Gustavo?
Yes. Thank you, Scott. So I think and thank you for sharing about Manisha. I will just say concerning her, what I really liked was how she really took responsibility for her choices and really invested in herself and contributed, and that showed a lot of maturation. And as I turn to Gustavo, I definitely think Gustavo's story is one of the most on the surface dramatic of the four. And so, of course, we've had clients with probably equally dramatic stories as Gustavo's. And one thing that I think is really important when you've had an extreme story or life experience or experiences that you want to share is ensuring that enough data, enough information is shared, but not too much, as well as coming across as what have I learned from this? What have I taken away? And how is it connected to my goal to attend business school as well as post MBA goals? Again, this might not be something that you are asked to directly state in your HBS essay, but it is important that you connect, that you at least touch on it, but not make it your main, rehashing of your post MBA goals. So before I go into more advice on that topic, let's talk a little bit about Gustavo's profile. So Gustavo, as a young boy, experienced his father flying a plane that ultimately was unrecovered. So his father to this day is missing. And this was probably, most likely, very traumatic for Gustavo and his family. And it also sparked in him a fascination with flight and flight safety. And And this is something that he probably wasn't able to pursue in high school or as an undergrad, but he definitely pursued it wholeheartedly in his free time and personal life. He did, and as you can see, post-graduation, post-undergrad, he went to work for Boeing. Although ultimately it did prove to be a frustrating career for him. And he saw himself more as an entrepreneur and somebody who wanted to work for himself. And so this is why he has, built planes, flown planes, had to rebuild them. And so it makes him a very provocative and thought-provoking candidate for schools. Schools will also want to know, whether it's Stanford or HBS or any of the other schools Gustavos applying to, that he also has his feet proverbially planted firmly on the ground. So will he be somebody who will attend class regularly, who will do the work, who will be able to listen and interact with others well, even when he's not the quote unquote boss in a situation? So I definitely think his story and life experiences will gain the attention of his file reader and the admissions committee. They're going to want to know that the Gustavos of the world are well balanced as well. And I'll pause there, Scott.
No, it's a great question, Jenifer. And I think part of the reason we brought in the example Gustavo, which is totally fictional, and as Jenifer mentioned, a hyper example, right? It's an example that most people won't experience in their life. Most of us won't build or fly our own planes. What we don't want you to come away from this example thinking is that, I have to have done something like Gustavo to get the attention of a top school. That's not true. But what we want to hit home is that it's all about kind of taking that key life transition point and really kind of unpacking it. And we've talked a lot about journaling and kind of pre-writing. It's really like journaling out of that moment to think about, like, how was I changed by a big experience I had in my life? Like, what different facets of me were updated, maybe for the better or worse sometimes, like we're constantly changing. But to really brainstorm and break that out into different components is what can allow you to then talk about how you were transformed, like how you became different. And I think a lot of times as candidates, when you're applying to school, you're thinking about who you are right now, but not how you became that person. And a really successful essay to Harvard, Stanford, or other top schools is going to take us on a journey. It's going to be compressed. To Jenifer's point, you can't tell all the details, but a compressed journey of how you got from A to B. And it may focus on elements of yourself that aren't professional. It reminds me of I had a client I worked with recently who was we'll keep this broad so we don't identify the client, but had some grandparents who lived in Eastern Europe who he actually spent summers with when he was very small, and that was a really formative experience for him in a number of ways. But he was hesitant to kind of bring it into an essay, and he said, like, well, why would they want to hear about this farm that my grandparents owned? And I said, well, because it really informed your first identity, like how you think about the world, how you think about, how you think about access to resources, healthcare, things like that. And so I think it's important to just note that there's no story that's off limits, right? And as you work with your consultant or you're working with friends and family to put together these applications, at least in your drafts, go anywhere. Like, don't be afraid to kind of try something. And if it doesn't work, you can always redraft or reshape, right? But nothing's really off limits. And I think that's an important place to start, because I think a lot of you in the audience are probably risk averse, and you have kind of narrow limits and narrow boundaries. And so stretching those a little bit, talking about yourself at times where you were vulnerable, had to undergo significant changes, is how you can start to get committee's attention and tell meaningful stories. Well, great. So want to make some time for audience Q&A. Jenifer, we've obviously been talking for a long time here. So audience members, go ahead and please put questions in the chat. Happy to talk about Harvard, Stanford essays in particular. If you have like a broader question, we could certainly address that. And there's a couple of kind of housekeeping items that I will address that people have asked. Will this be uploaded onto the channel? Yes, it will be uploaded onto the channel. Randy, thanks for asking. This will be on GMAT Club's channel for as long as the channel is up, so you can refer back to it. Let's see. Sugata has a question, Jenifer, that I think we could address to start off, maybe while other questions are coming in the chat. And so Goddess says, say that I have kind of multiple domain experiences. So maybe I've worked in different industries, different functions. How do I order those in building my story? And I'm thinking maybe, Jenifer, we can broaden this, because I'm thinking there's probably audience members that not only have multiple, maybe they worked in different industries, but maybe life experience wise, they had like multiple formative experiences and they're trying to figure out where to start. What recommendations would you have for them?
Oh gosh. So I always say maybe starting with your resume before you get to your set of essays, and really thinking about in that one-page resume, which is usually B school format, looking chronologically at what you've done. And I always say to clients, it's order of magnitude. The first bullet point should be what was the most important or impactful work that you've done at an organization. Now, after you got done, going through like the rank order for each job that you've had, really thinking to yourself, connecting the dots and thinking, why did I take that job out of undergrad? Or why did I do those internships? Often many of you have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 internships. How did those internships then lead to my first post-undergrad job? Why did I stay? Perhaps we do have a handful of clients who've worked for one employer post-undergrad. So why did they stay? Often it's because they were able to do many things in that one company or firm. I would say even more of you have had 2, 3, sometimes 4 jobs before you're applying to business school. So really thinking, intentionally, why did you take a job? Why did it work well at that time? What were you able to achieve? What was your impact? And then the question is, which most schools will ask you in the biodata fields, why did you move on? Reason for leaving. So asking yourself those questions. And there's always a story. And sometimes the personal is impacting. You really loved a job. You valued and respected your employer, but perhaps a family member got sick, or a life circumstance demanded that you move, that you leave your company. You maybe even had a leave of absence while you attended to something personal in your life. That also is part of the story. And during that time, when you weren't working, you realized, hey, I think this is what I want to do. This is who I am, and this is what I want to do with my life. So having all of that, that's why I'm holding up my notebook. Journaling can be very powerful to really sit with your thoughts. And so why did I do that? Why was that job situation, that job choice right for me then, but not right for me now? I hope I'm answering the question, Scott. So it's not just about ordering like what's important, but also really understanding the why behind all of your choices.
No, that's a great answer, Jenifer. That having that structure to it can really help you start to suss out where you want to go. And I think to that question around, say you have multiple formative experiences that have happened to you, like which one do you pick? I mean, I think ultimately you're going to have to probably pick one to make your focus when you do an essay. But if you have multiple that you feel really strongly about, you could deploy one in one school application and one in another one, or you could plan to have some talking points ready to talk about it. Maybe if you get to the interview round, right? Because the interview is going to be another chance for you to kind of share things about yourself that aren't in the formal application, and so that's another touch point that you might have later in the process. Here's a good one, Jenifer. Oh, do you have something you wanted to add?
Quickly before we move on, a lot of our clients have, as you can imagine, real anxiety about how to figure out the why of their stories. Please know we have an online career vision course that will really take you through detailing you, the professional. We have a strategy questionnaire form, very lengthy, form and a lot of detail. We will ask you questions about you, the student, you, the professional, and you, the person. So we're going to help you go through this process. We have a leadership skills assessment, and we have a number of diagnostic tools and resources. So please know we're not just asking you to, buy a journal and journal, although that can be wonderful. We really do have resources for you. And I'll stop there, Scott.
That's a great point, Jenifer, because I think the business focused audience sometimes is like, journaling, what is that? I don't know how to journal. And so structure around that framework is really helpful. And so those are things that we certainly provided and clients find helpful. Here's a really good one, Jenifer. This one, I feel like I've been asked this before. Lillian asks, with round 2 coming up, do you think there is a risk of narratives already being represented in the admit class, or is this a myth? So this question around like, are there stories that get overrepresented? I have some initial thoughts that I would love to hear.
Scott, please.
And I would say that I think the myth aspect of this comes from the fact that candidates spend more time talking to each other about the story they're going to tell than actually working on telling the story. And so as a consequence of that, it seems probably like, oh, well, this person is writing a story about, moving to a foreign country and having to kind of like, become a new person in that country. So I can't do that because they're doing that. And if you're in that mindset of, I can't talk about my experience because I'm afraid other people have the same, I think you're kind of missing the point of these essays, because once you deploy your own story with detail, right? So not just the big thing that happened to you. Maybe you lost a loved one, right? Or Gustavos' case, like give the your father, you have that same connection. That's the beginning of a story. It's not the whole story. It's not the details. It's not the next steps you took. It's not the impacts that specifically had on you. And so I think it's really important to actually take a step back from the chatter, especially when you're thinking about the essay you're going to deploy, and not trying to compare your story to other people's, but instead to think about what's the most authentic, kind of memorable, kind of movie trailer version of my life that I can set up for somebody who doesn't know me. I'm going to trust that my details and my individuality will come through if I'm detail oriented, and go from there. So that's my kind of approach to it, Jenifer. I think that it is a myth. I think it's more a factor of candidates talking to each other instead of like writing their stories. But what do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think that underlying the question being asked is I think, if I may say so, it's about competition. And what I would say is, you're not competing. I'd like you to believe you're not competing with others, but that you're actually trying to show up as your most authentic self. And so really it is about you telling your authentic truth as closely as you can. And that will, after I say there are so many excellent candidates applying to these schools, it isn't about your GMAT score, GPA, and having solid recommendations alone. What I believe gains you a seat in one of these top MBA programs are your essays. And you don't have to be the best accountant, best iBanker, best entrepreneur. What you have to do is be the most real self, so that your file reader and the adcom, they say, I really know who this person is. And you know what? I really see them in our class. So it's really a competition. You are running your own race when you get to the essay part. Okay.
Yeah, running your own race is a really good way to put it, Jenifer. And if you take that approach, right, you can kind of silence the white noise. You'll just represent yourself better. It's kind of like a job interview, right? If you went into it worrying about what all the other candidates had done, you wouldn't execute as well. And I think the business school process is very similar. You have to focus on what you can control and what you can contribute. Great. So here's a question about how far back to go with stories. This is a good question. This is Dr. Dre May, who's been very engaged the whole time. Thanks, Dr. Dre. HBS, for the HBS essay question, how far into the past should I go? I do feel like there has been some life-changing experiences in my early high school days, but I feel like I should stick to my life during and post-uni. So Jenifer, here's a question where it sounds like they're internalizing this whole idea of like, you shouldn't talk about, work experiences before uni, but can you go back before that for formative life experiences? What would you say?
I would say the short answer is it depends. So I've worked with clients who've talked about experiences that their 10-year-old self experienced in life that really influenced and impacted them going forward in a really profound way. So please don't worry too much about age. It's more about what you know to be true thanks to or due to that life circumstance or situation. And so what did you learn from it? How articulate can you be around that life experience? So don't worry about the actual point of time.
Yeah. And I would just add to what Jenifer said by saying, I think it's important. You can write about anything in the past, any kind of existential change you had, but then it's helpful to link it to your professional self in some way, right? So, it doesn't really make sense to tell a story about your past that's not in some way informed, the type of professional you've become. And I think a lot of times you kind of do one or the other in the essay. You're very focused on your job and your career progression, or you tell a story about, maybe a family member you lost and how that changed you. But tying those together. So how do you show up differently at work as a result of the loss you experienced, or a joy? Maybe you had the birth of a child and that really kind of changed your experience. So I think tying the two together for the committee is going to not only help you be more memorable, but also be kind of logical, consistent, and make sense, right? If this is a movie, we want the beginning to tie to the end, right? So I think that's just an important thing to note. All right, so let's see. Okay, so this might be a good one to kind of close out on, Jenifer, as we think about kind of the relationship between the essay and the rest of the application. Kelvin asks, what is the relationship between my essay that I write and my recommenders' essays? And I like that Kelvin calls them essays, because for some letter writers they are and some they aren't. So can you talk about that relationship and your thoughts on it?
Well, Scott, I think I did touch on this earlier in our call today. I think it can be very powerful if your recommenders have mentioned something about you that perhaps goes beyond the professional, that they understand that you're actively engaged either in community efforts through the company or outside of the company. So what are you doing? What's important to you? The recommenders understanding this and acknowledging this in the LORs can be very powerful and consistent when you do that as well in your essays. So I am a fan of that. I support that.
I am a fan as well. I would just say that I agree wholeheartedly with Jenifer's perspective there. We have one final question, Jenifer, that is not related to essays, but I feel like we'll answer it because we have time. Someone's asking about Rex to Pick. They're a small business owner. They own a family business. And they're wondering who they could seek potentially as recommenders. But they say it's important to note that they run a touring business, that they only meet the clients once. And so they're not able to kind of get client recs. So ideas of how you would advise that person on recommender selection. It's an interesting question.
Well, I just want to caveat what I'm about to say with I'm not sure I have enough data about the caller or the advice seeker. However, I would say that it's about being creative and thinking, maybe not creativity might not be the right word, but thinking broadly about who you might work with. So are there suppliers? Are there partners? Could there be a professional mentor who you've worked with in the past before you became an entrepreneur who helped inform you establishing your own company? I absolutely hear you that your clients are one-time or one experience clients, but I would look at suppliers. I would look at mentors. If you have, and again, your company might not have this, but board of directors could also, if you have people who have helped set up your company, they might also they might also be a recommender for you. Scott, is there anything you would add to what I've said?
I think you covered it, Jenifer. Again, context is helpful there, but I think getting creative and maybe starting with a list of all the people you could potentially ask, even if they're a little bit out of left field. And then I think one way to narrow it is to ask yourself, would they write a good letter? And I think someone going to bat for you is often more important than who they are, their title, things like that. Those things can carry weight, absolutely. Like if you get a recommendation from a partner at McKinsey, that certainly carries weight. But a very strong, detailed recommendation from someone is almost always worth more than a really short, quick one. So I think that's just what I would add to close. I appreciate too. I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Draymate for summarizing the key points from today, which I think are spot on. Thank you, Dr. Draymate, for that. And just to give the audience members a chance to connect with us moving forward. As we mentioned, Fortuna, we do free consultations. Again, these are totally free. There's no strings attached. So if you want to sign up for one of those, you can visit our website. The link is here. Sign up for that free consultation. If you mention Scott or Jenifer when you sign up as someone you want to connect with, we can make sure to have those conversations with you directly. Otherwise, you'll be matched with the other very capable, amazing members of our customer success team. With that, we will wrap things up today. Jenifer, thank you so much for your time and insights. Really appreciated them.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the GMAT Club for hosting us.
Yes, thank you very much, GMAT Club. Again, if you all could click the like button on the streaming platform that you're using, that'll really help GMAT Club get the word out and continue to bring more amazing content to the admission space. We wish you all best of luck with your applications coming up here in round 2. And we hope you have a great rest of your year in the months ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.